The email came in on a Tuesday. Subject line just, September site visit, Boclair. Routine. I'd done maybe 40 of these in 6 years, and by 2021, most of them ran the same way. You show up, you check the paperwork, you talk to a few inmates in private, you leave, you write it up. Sometimes you find something small, rarely you find something big. Boclair, on paper, had never given anyone a reason to look twice. It sits about an hour and change north of Baton Rouge, off a state road that thins out into pine and pasture before you see the fence. Private facility, medium security, contracted to the state, roughly 600 beds. I'd never been assigned there before. The drive in that morning was slow because a school bus in front of me kept stopping, and I remember being weirdly grateful for it because I hate arriving early. Early makes people nervous, and nervous people hide things badly, which sounds useful but really just makes the visit take twice as long. I pulled up at 8:52. The warden was already outside. That was the first thing. Not a red flag, just a note. Wardens are busy. They don't stand in the parking lot at 9 in the morning waiting on a monitor. He had 2 officers with him, one on each side, both in pressed uniforms with their sleeves rolled the exact same way. He shook my hand with both of his and told me to call him by his first name, which I'll skip. Let's just say he was late 50s, silver crew cut, the kind of soft handshake that a big man uses to seem harmless. "Coffee's on inside," he said. "We're happy to have you." Inside was a conference room with a spread, danishes, a fruit tray, 3 thermoses. That was too much. Most facilities give you a plastic bottle of water and a chair. I sat down, took a Danish, because refusing food is rude, and I've learned to eat what people give me, and opened my laptop. He introduced the officers. I'll call them Ross and the tall one. Ross was maybe 40, thick through the shoulders, with a small burn scar on the back of his right hand. The tall one had to be 6'5", wiry, jaw always working like he was chewing gum that wasn't there. Neither of them was assigned to any post I asked about. When I asked what their roles were, the warden said, "They're going to make sure you have everything you need today." I said I usually just needed a badge and a floor plan. He smiled. "We like to be thorough." Okay, fine. I've had escorts before. It's normal to have one person walking you between units for security. 2 is unusual, but not unheard of. I put it in my notes and we started the walkthrough. Intake first, then medical, then A block, then B block, then the yard, then the kitchen, then the segregation unit, which they called restricted housing, because that's what everyone calls it now. Every time we passed through a set of doors, Ross buzzed us through with his card. The tall one walked behind me, the warden walked beside me, and at every unit we entered, without fail, the same 2 officers were already there. Not similar officers, the same 2. A short guy with a red mustache and a woman with her hair in a tight braid. Name tag that read a single syllable I'll skip. At first I thought I was seeing things. Facilities are big, but not that big. And shift rotations mean you see repeat faces. But by the 4th block I was sure. Red mustache had been at intake when we started, and now he was at the kitchen. And he hadn't taken any hallway I'd taken. He'd gotten there ahead of us. And every time we entered a room, he was already leaning against a wall, arms crossed, watching the inmates, not us. The inmates saw him and stopped talking. That's the part I want to be clear about, because it's the thing you can't put in a photograph. I'd walk into a day room, and there'd be a card game going, a TV on, 2 guys arguing about the Saints. Then Red Mustache would shift his weight, and the whole room would go quiet like a switch had flipped. Not scared quiet, trained quiet. I did the paper part first. Cell counts, meal logs, medical passes, grievance forms. The grievance box in B block was mounted so high on the wall that a shorter inmate couldn't reach it without asking for help. I noted that. I checked the log. In the last 90 days, they'd received 4 grievances at a facility of 600 people. National average for a place that size is somewhere between 40 and 80. I noted that too. Around 11, I told the warden I wanted to start the confidential interviews. That's the part of the visit that matters. Every incarcerated person has the right to speak to a monitor without staff in the room. It's not a courtesy. It's in the contract the state signed with the company that owns Boclair, and it's in the federal guidelines above that. The whole point is that people can tell you things they can't tell you with a guard listening. If you don't get that part, you didn't do the visit. I asked for a private room. He walked me to one. It was fine, small, table and 2 chairs. A camera in the corner that he said was audio off. I said I'd like the first inmate brought in. Then he sat down in the second chair. I waited a second because sometimes people just need to be reminded. I said, "This part is one-on-one." He folded his hands on the table and gave me that same soft smile. Protocol. Officer needs to be present for the safety of the visitor. That's not the procedure. It's our procedure. Ross was standing at the door. The tall one was in the hall. I could see him through the wire glass, not looking in, just there. I've been in this job long enough to know when to argue and when to keep taking notes. Arguing right then would have ended the visit. He'd have called it a security concern, walked me out, and I'd have had nothing on paper except a complaint about being asked to leave. So I said, "Understood," and I wrote down the exact time, the exact language he used, and the fact that he did not leave when I invoked the standard. Then I did the interviews with him sitting there. Nobody said much. A man in his 60s with a shake in his hands told me the food was fine. A younger guy said he'd been waiting on a dental appointment for a while, would not specify how long. A third one, tattoos up both arms, looked at the warden the entire time I was talking to him and answered every question with, "No complaints, ma'am." When I asked him if he felt safe, he paused, just for a beat, then said, "Yes, ma'am." His left hand was under the table the whole time. When they stood him up to walk him out, I saw why. 2 of his fingers were splinted with what looked like a torn strip of a sheet and a pen barrel. Not a medical splint, a homemade one. I wrote that down too. The tour finished around 3. The warden walked me back to the lobby and told me he hoped I'd found everything in order. I said I appreciated his hospitality. He asked when the report would be filed. I told him the truth, which was that reports go in within 10 business days. He nodded and shook my hand with both of his again. In the parking lot, I sat in my car for a full minute before I started it. Red Mustache was standing in the lobby window, watching me through the glass. He didn't move when I looked at him. He didn't look away. He just watched until I pulled out of the lot, and I could still see him in my rear view when I hit the road. I stopped at a gas station about 20 miles down and wrote for an hour in the front seat, straight into my laptop, while everything was fresh. Every officer's post at every hour. Every time the same 2 showed up ahead of us. The grievance box height in inches, guessed but close. The splint. The pause before, "Yes, ma'am." The exact phrasing of protocol and our procedure. The 4 grievances in 90 days. I did not file the standard visit summary. I filed something else, addressed to the State Oversight Office with a copy to the Corrections Ombudsman. 22 pages. It went out on a Thursday. The follow-up visit was 3 weeks later, and I wasn't alone. 4 of us, with expanded authority under the office's emergency review provision. When we walked in, the warden was not in the parking lot. Red Mustache was not in the lobby. Ross had been reassigned to a different facility 2 counties over, on paper. The tall one had taken personal leave. We did the interviews the way they're supposed to be done. 1 person, 1 room, door closed, no officer present. The first man cried before he said anything. The second one talked for almost 2 hours. By the end of the second day, we had names for things that had happened in restricted housing that I'm not going to write out here. We had a list of inmates who'd asked for medical care and been told to write a grievance, knowing the box was where it was. We found out what the splint on the tattooed man's fingers was for. The warden was placed on administrative leave within the week. 2 captains and a lieutenant went with him. The company that ran Boclair lost the contract by the end of the following year and sold the facility to another operator, which is how these things usually end, in a name change on a sign. I testified twice, once at the state level, once in a civil suit brought by 3 of the men from B Block. The lawyer asked me on the stand what first made me suspect something was wrong. I said it was the coffee spread. He asked me to clarify. I said that in 6 years of this work, nobody had ever put out a fruit tray for me, and the ones who wanted to were usually the ones with the most to hide. The tattooed man got his fingers looked at eventually. They'd healed crooked by then. I saw him in the hallway outside the courtroom on the day I testified. He nodded at me. I nodded back. Neither of us said anything because there was nothing to say that the room needed to hear. I've worked the graveyard shift at the city records office in Richmond for almost 3 years, and the only reason I noticed anything was because I was bored out of my mind. That's the honest answer. Not intuition, not some feeling. Boredom. The building sits off Marshall Street, back behind the parking deck where the county leases half a floor for storage. Old brick, HVAC that clicks every 12 minutes, and one of those buzzing overhead lights above the intake desk that nobody ever fixes because the bulb technically works. My job was to take physical personnel files, verify the metadata against what was already in the system, scan anything missing, and mark the folder as processed. Boxes came up from long-term storage on a cart. I did about 60 files a night. Most of them belonged to people who had retired before I was born. February 2022. I remember because we had that ice storm the second week and I slept in my car in the garage for 2 nights so I wouldn't have to drive. The file was in a batch from personnel storage, not the retirement stacks, which was the first thing that was a little off, but not enough to notice. Active employee files usually stayed with HR upstairs. Sometimes older, active ones got shuffled down for scanning if the person had been there long enough that their paper record was thick. 7 years counts as long enough for a lot of departments. The folder itself looked completely normal. Manila, standard tab, the little colored stickers on the corner for department, facilities, and systems. I opened it flat on the desk and started running through the checklist. Name on the tab matched the name on the intake form. Date of hire, 2015. Position, Systems Administrator, Tier 2. That meant access to the city's internal network, which I only knew because we had a memo about it the summer before, when they rotated some permissions. I flipped to the biographical page. Date of birth, listed as March of 1987. I typed it into the field, then moved to the education section. Bachelor's in Information Systems. School name I won't repeat here. Graduation date, May 2008. Enrollment date, September 2005. I did the math without meaning to. 2005 minus 1987. He would have been 18 starting college. That was fine. Graduation at 21. Also fine. Then I turned the page, and there was a copy of the diploma itself. It was clean, high resolution, the kind of thing HR keeps because someone needs to prove the person actually finished. And the date on the diploma was different. May 2007. Not by much, 1 year. But the enrollment record said fall of 2005, and the diploma said May 2007, which meant he finished a 4-year degree in a year and 8 months. Not impossible, but the transcript stapled behind it listed 8 semesters, not compressed. Fall, spring, 4 times through. I sat there with a highlighter in my hand and looked at it for a while. Ice was ticking against the window over the file cabinets. The heater cut on. The thing is, I've seen document errors before, constantly. People fill forms out wrong. HR mistypes things. Someone photocopies a diploma at an angle and a 2 looks like a 7. Once I found a guy whose middle initial changed 3 times in the same folder because different administrations spelled his name differently. Errors are the whole reason my job exists. So I told myself I'd flag it, note it, and move on. But before I did that, I flipped back to the biographical page just to double check I'd read it right. The date of birth was still March 1987. Fine. But underneath, in the field for previous address, there was a listing for an apartment in Norfolk. Below it, in smaller print, the move-in date, October 1985. He was 2 years old. Now, that could easily be a childhood address. Plenty of forms ask for previous addresses going back years. I've seen guys list where they grew up, so I read the header on that section again. It said, previous residence prior to current. Current was a house in Henrico County, move-in 2018. So the form was asking him what address he lived at right before Henrico. and he had written down a place he was at when he was in kindergarten. That was strange, but a person could be strange. Maybe he'd put down the Norfolk address by mistake because it was the one he'd memorized as a kid. I made a note, kept going. Third document was a background check summary from the hiring packet, standard form. It listed a driver's license number, issue state Virginia, first issued in 2004. And then, in the same document, a note that said the applicant had relocated to Virginia in 2011. I read that twice. If he moved to Virginia in 2011, he shouldn't have had a Virginia license issued in 2004. Unless he'd lived here before, moved away, moved back, that's possible. But there was no other Virginia address in the file. The whole rest of the history was Ohio and one stint in Maryland. I got up and walked to the coffee maker at the back of the room. The pot had been sitting since 10. It tasted like a penny. I drank it anyway and stood there looking at the row of gray cabinets. Here's what I was actually thinking. I was thinking that if I flagged this, someone in HR would look at it, and they'd shrug, and they'd correct the entries, and the file would come back to me next month with clean data, and I'd have wasted my time. I was thinking about how much I did not want to write a long email about paperwork at 3 in the morning. I went back to the desk. Fourth document was a training certificate, some kind of security clearance course the city required for people who touched the network, issued by a private contractor, dated 2016. The signature line at the bottom had the instructor's name and title, and a business address. I pulled up the contractor's website on my phone, mostly out of habit, because I was already suspicious and I wanted to see if the letterhead matched. The company had gone out of business in 2014. I stared at the certificate. It looked good. The seal was clean, the paper had the right weight, the font on the header was consistent. It was the kind of document you'd only ever check if you were already looking. That was the point where I stopped feeling bored. I closed the folder. I didn't put it back on the cart. I put it flat under my keyboard, which sounds stupid now, but the folder had started to feel like something I wanted covered up. Not because I thought anything would happen. I just didn't want to look at it while I finished the batch. I did another 12 files, every single one clean. Then I sat down and wrote an email to the HR director. I didn't say anything dramatic. I listed the documents by page, date of birth versus previous address, diploma date versus enrollment, license issue date versus relocation date, training certificate versus vendor operating dates. 4 items, 2 paragraphs. I sent it at 4:47 in the morning. I clocked out. I drove home on empty streets with salt trucks moving the other way. The reply came 3 days later, but not from HR. It was from a woman in the city's Office of Internal Audit, whose name I didn't recognize. She asked me to come in during regular hours, not my usual shift, and to bring the folder. I brought it. She was maybe 50, wore a cardigan, had a legal pad with a lot of handwriting on it already. There was a man in the room with her who didn't introduce himself and didn't sit down. She asked me how I'd noticed. I told her the truth. Boredom. Bad math on the education page. She asked if I'd told anyone else. I said no. She asked if I'd made copies. I said no. The man asked if the folder had been out of my possession at any point after I noticed. I said it was under my keyboard for about 2 hours and otherwise on the cart. They took the folder. She thanked me. That was it, for a while. What I learned later I got in pieces. Some of it from a coworker in HR who wasn't really supposed to talk about it, and some of it from a short internal notice that went out to staff 4 months later. Phrased so vaguely it could have meant anything. The man who had worked in facilities and systems for 7 years was not the man on the file. The documents were forgeries, not sloppy ones. The kind you'd only catch if you laid 4 of them next to each other and did arithmetic. The birth date and the childhood address didn't match because whoever assembled the identity had used pieces from more than one real person and hadn't cross-checked. The diploma was real paper from a real school, with the name and date altered. The license number belonged to somebody who died in 2009. Who he actually was took several months to establish. Nobody ever told me the answer. He didn't come back to work after the audit meeting. His desk was cleaned out on a Saturday, and by Monday there was a temp sitting in his chair, using a fresh workstation. Nobody on his team seemed to know anything, or if they did, they weren't saying. I still work nights at the archive. Same shift, same coffee, same clicking HVAC. They didn't move me or promote me or thank me beyond the one email from the woman in the cardigan. I check the dates now, all of them. Birth against hire, diploma against enrollment, license against relocation, certificates against the companies that issued them. Most of the time everything lines up. Occasionally I find a typo. Once in a while a real error that gets corrected in a week. I have not found another folder like the first one. That doesn't mean much. The math on that one only worked because somebody got lazy on page 2. If they hadn't, I'd have marked it processed and gone home. October 2020. I was 3 years into driving an armored truck out of a lot on the west side of Detroit. Not a bad job if you can handle sitting for 10 hours a day next to a guy who chews sunflower seeds and spits the shells into an empty Gatorade bottle. My partner's name was Perry, older guy, ex-corrections, wore a wedding ring on a chain around his neck because his fingers had gotten too swollen to slide it on. He rode shotgun, I drove. That was the deal. Our route was the same 4 days a week. Bank branch off Grand River, credit union on Livernois, a check cashing spot near the Fisher building, then the big pickup at a branch on the edge of Corktown. Same order, same times, give or take 15 minutes for traffic. We were supposed to vary it, and the dispatcher would tell us we were varying it, but you can only vary a fixed route so much when the businesses have set drop windows. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I'm not a paranoid guy. I've had one gun pulled on me in 3 years, and it was by a drunk at a gas station who didn't even know what we were. Perry used to say the job wasn't dangerous. It was just boring dressed up in Kevlar. The first time I noticed the car was the second week of October. Blue Chevy Malibu, one of those older ones, with the trim starting to peel around the wheel wells, and a dent above the rear passenger tire that had been touched up with the wrong shade of blue. Michigan plate. I only noticed it because when we pulled up to the Grand River branch, it was already parked across the street, engine running, and it pulled off the second we came to a stop. I clocked it because that's the kind of thing they train you to clock. Then I forgot about it. Except then it was at Livernois too. Same day, different intersection, further down, but the same car, same guy at the wheel. I couldn't see his face, just a beard and a ball cap, and a hand on the steering wheel with what looked like a class ring on it. He pulled out again the moment we parked. Third stop that same day, Fisher building. Malibu was already leaving as we came around the corner. Now, 4 times in a shift can be coincidence. Detroit isn't that big. People run errands. I told Perry about it in the truck between the 3rd and 4th stops. He barely looked up from his phone. "You're gonna drive yourself nuts, kid. Every blue Chevy in this city is gonna look the same to you now." He wasn't wrong that Malibus are common. He wasn't wrong that I could be seeing a pattern that wasn't there. But the guy in the car hadn't been sitting there. He'd been parked and running, which is what you do when you're waiting on something and don't want to shut the engine off. The next day, the Malibu was at Grand River again, and Livernois, and Fisher. Same order. Always gone before we finished up. By the end of that week, I started writing things down in the little notepad we're supposed to use for incident logs. Not incidents, just blue Malibu, Grand River, 9:47, gone by 9:49. Just so I could show Perry it wasn't in my head. He looked at the list on Friday and told me, in the nicest way an ex-corrections officer can tell you anything, that I was going to give myself an ulcer, and that if I really believed what I was writing down, I needed to call it in and stop bothering him about it. I didn't call it in. I don't know exactly why. Part of it was that Perry had 10 more years on the job than me, and I didn't want to be the new guy crying wolf. Part of it was that every time I really tried to picture what I was going to say into the phone, it sounded stupid. There's a guy in a Chevy. He leaves when we get there. He hasn't done anything. Week 3, same thing. Every day. Never at all 4 stops in one shift, but always at least 2, sometimes 3. I started varying my own driving. Different side streets on the approach. Coming in from the opposite direction. Didn't matter. he was already there, or he was leaving. I never once caught him actually watching us. He was always in the process of pulling away. One time on Livernois, I saw him make a left before we'd even come to a full stop. I couldn't tell you if he'd been on his phone or looking in his mirror or what, just the back of a ball cap and the taillight turning. I tried to get a picture with my phone once from the truck window. It came out blurry and useless. The plate a smear I could talk myself into reading 3 different ways. Perry did notice him once. He didn't say much. He said, "Huh," and then he ate more sunflower seeds. The other thing I want to tell you is that October in Detroit that year was strange. It was the middle of COVID. Streets that were usually clogged were half empty. A lot of the offices around our stops were still closed or working with skeleton crews. There was less traffic to hide in, less noise. When you sit in an armored truck all day, you get used to the sound of the city. And that fall, the city sounded muffled, like somebody had thrown a wool blanket over it. It made things you'd normally miss stand out, which is maybe why I noticed him. Or maybe he just got sloppy because there were fewer cars around for him to slip in behind. I stopped sleeping right, not in a dramatic way. I'd just wake up around 4 in the morning and lie there thinking about that class ring on the steering wheel. My girlfriend at the time asked me twice if I was okay. I said I was fine. I said I was just tired. Then week 4 started. Monday, no Malibu. Grand River, nothing. Livernois, nothing. I actually felt myself relax on the drive to the Fisher building, and I remember thinking, all right, maybe Perry was right. Maybe it was a guy who worked at one of the banks and got laid off. Maybe I was seeing what I wanted to see. Fisher building, nothing. No blue Chevy, no beard, no ring. We rolled up to the 4th stop, the branch out by Corktown, right on schedule. I pulled the truck up to the curb the same way I did every day. Perry was already unbuckling. I killed the engine. And then I saw it. On the sidewalk, between our truck and the front door of the branch. Chalk. White, kids' chalk. The fat kind you use to draw on driveways. 2 words in block capitals. Not today. I didn't say anything at first. I just looked at it. It was fresh enough that the edges hadn't been scuffed by anyone walking through, and the leaves that had blown in overnight were sitting on top of the letters, not stuck in the chalk dust. Whoever wrote it had taken their time. The letters were maybe a foot tall. There was a little smear at the end, like they'd dragged their sleeve. Perry saw it when he opened his door. I watched his face. I've seen Perry annoyed, and I've seen him bored. And one time, I saw him laugh so hard at a joke on the radio, he had to pull his glasses off to wipe his eyes. I'd never seen the look he had then. It was the look of a man doing math in his head and not liking the answer. He closed his door. He said, very quietly, "Get us out of here." I didn't argue. I didn't ask. I put the truck back in gear and I pulled away from the curb slower than I wanted to, because Perry told me not to look like we were running. We drove 2 blocks. He got on the radio. He didn't say much, just gave our unit number and said we had a situation at the 4th stop and needed to talk to a supervisor on a landline. The dispatcher tried to get more out of him and he told her, again, landline. We pulled into the lot of a hardware store. Perry got out and used his personal phone. I sat in the driver's seat with my hand on the wheel and my other hand on the door handle, and I watched every single car that came down the street. None of them were blue. None of them had a beard behind the wheel. I watched anyway. When he got back in the truck, Perry didn't look at me. He just said, "You were right, kid." The rest of that day is a blur. We didn't finish the route. Another crew came out to cover the last stop. Somebody from the company's internal security met us back at the lot and took our incident notes, including my stupid little list with the times and the plate fragment I'd caught once. They asked us the same questions about 6 different ways. When did you first notice him? What did he look like? Are you sure it was the same car? Did anyone at the branches know about the chalk? Nobody at the Corktown branch had seen it get written. There was a camera on the corner, but it was angled at the ATM vestibule, not the sidewalk. They changed our route the next week. New order, new times, and they added a second unmarked car that trailed us at a distance for about a month. I never saw the Malibu again. Nobody I worked with ever saw it again, as far as I know. 3 months later, a truck belonging to another company got hit on a route not far from where we used to run. Not our stops, not our company, but close enough that when I read about it on my phone at the kitchen table, I put the phone down and sat there for a while. 2 guards. One of them got shot in the leg. The take was in 6 figures. The article said the crew knew the schedule. That was the phrase they used, knew the schedule. I quit the following spring. Not because of that, or not only because of that. Perry retired about 6 months after I left. We text once in a while. We've never talked about the chalk on the phone, only in person, and only once, and only after he'd had a couple of beers. He said the thing that bothers him is that we can't know which one it was. Whether the guy in the Malibu had been casing us for a month and something spooked him off, or whether the guy in the Malibu had been trying to work up the nerve to tell somebody and had finally settled for 2 words on a sidewalk because saying it out loud was more than he could do. I've turned it over a lot of ways. I've tried to picture the guy walking up to that branch that morning with a piece of chalk in his coat pocket. I can't ever quite see his face, just the ball cap, just the ring, just the taillight turning.